Thank you so much, Deja, and welcome to all of you. It's great to see those of you on the call this morning. Thank you for taking your time to join this panel. I myself am really excited about what's coming here in this next hour, and I hope the same is true for you. As Deja mentioned, we've really got some high quality colleagues here on the call here today who are going to share their experiences and their wisdom with us. So we will certainly leave room for questions at the end. So I would encourage you to put them down into the chat as you have them. But we're going to go ahead and get started here. Jen, I'm going to get started with you with our first question. Reports have been clear about a shift happening in this space. We're seeing fewer donors and larger gifts from a small group. So can you share your perspective in looking at the sector as a whole? What are those key factors that are driving this shift?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so happy to be here with my colleagues and with all of you. So happy Friday. And there's a lot of conversation, as you can imagine, about what is causing the shifts that we have been seeing over the last few years. And so some of the explanations are financial and policy reasons. So things like rising economic inequality, stock market fluctuations, economic uncertainty in general, record high inflation. And so fundraisers have been kind of witnessing a shift in giving where fewer large donors are giving more of the dollars overall for a long time. So I don't think this is news, but it's just become more evident and pressing over the last few years. And, you know, some people probably just simply feel like they don't have the resources right now to give for a variety of reasons. And so inflation, for example, really hits regular households hard. When the things you need to live cost more money, you simply have less discretionary income. So those are some reasons. It's also, you know, there's also concerns that there are divides in trust. How do people feel about nonprofits right now? And, you know, in general, about 50% of the population says it trusts nonprofits. And that's high compared to how people feel about most other things. But that doesn't feel high to us, does it? When we're thinking about raising money and building support for our causes, 50% is just like, that should be better. Can we do better? Another couple of thoughts. You know, people are giving differently. We really saw that starting to happen really visibly during COVID, when we saw a lot of direct requests for support, were people helping people directly without a nonprofit provider in the middle. So those patterns might be changing, and some of that could be generational, right? Younger people have different ideas about how they want to give. That could be affecting that. And, you know, also, by the way, that maybe the things that we're doing as nonprofits to raise money aren't resonating as well. So there's a lot of societal things happening, but also perhaps it could be that then we aren't responding in the ways that we need to, maybe in part because we don't know how yet.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Jen. I was jotting down. I was really surprised by that 50% trust factor that you mentioned, because that does feel low for someone working in this space as well. So I'm hopeful that as we have the conversation today, we'll be able to take away some ideas and opportunities that will kind of hopefully increase that number. But I also appreciate lifting up those competing factors and how the sector response is certainly going to be different as we move forward from where we've been. So Tim, I'm going to move to you for our next question. Having helped many nonprofits as a consultant and now leading Firefly's fundraising efforts, can you elaborate on the role of ultra high net worth donors in the current philanthropic landscape of Central Indiana? So what are some of those strategies for engaging with them if an organization is connected to an ultra high net worth donor?
Certainly. Thanks, Shannon, and good morning, everyone. And hope everyone is ready for a Good Friday. This is a great panel and great discussion. When you think about, I want to go back to a couple of things that Jen said. The trend of fewer donors giving larger numbers or larger amounts of money, that's not new. And so but I think it's being, it's continuing to head down that path. So we have to think about that. And when we work with ultra high net worth donors, you really have to make sure um, that your values are aligned with the values of the donor. And I know that can be a really big topic. How do I know? But what ultimately I'm saying is you have to get to know the donor well, know what resonates with them, know what within your mission is most important to them, and that comes through. It's kind of like dating. You're not gonna ask the person to get married on the first or second or maybe even third date. Hopefully longer than that, but. Um, Really you have to think about that, and you have to grow that relationship over time. And ultimately, when you are ready to ask for that transformational gift, it shouldn't come to a surprise to the donor, and you should be ready. Another thing I really think, going back to a word that Jen used, and that's trust. And not only, having the trust from the donor or the prospective donor, is that you as or whoever the fundraiser is. Certainly you need to have trust with the donor, but also it's generally going to be with the leaders of your organization. And that's a key topic. And I recall a study that Johnson Grossnickel did several years ago, and it was $1 Million Ready. And one of the key factors, and that was specifically for higher education, but it was trust in the CEO and the president of the university. So, and that I think goes to the CEO, it goes to the board as well. And of course, anytime you can involve a peer in a major ask, of course, that's going to generate success as well. But I think aligning with the values, having that trust, and knowing that donor really well are some key factors to predicting success of a major ask.
Absolutely. As you were speaking, Tim, I was thinking of a quote that I've heard Marjorie Sims from Ascend at the Aspen Institute say, where she has said, relationships move at the speed of trust. And that has stuck with me so many times. And I was thinking of that as you were speaking. And so much of this comes down to relationships, right? And aligning on values and building those relationships over time. It is certainly not transactional. It takes time. So thank you for sharing. Maarten, we're going to move to you next. So given United Way's unique position as a recipient of typically unrestricted funding, how do you see the balance shifting between unrestricted versus restricted funding from major donors? And what should nonprofits do to manage the expectations that come along with these restricted gifts?
That's such an amazing question, especially given what Jen and Tim just talked about. Jen, something that I pull away from what you were saying is like the sectors in some ways like has shaped itself the situation that we're in right now, right? And one of the things that I feel like we're observing to one degree is how we have incentivized fundraisers to engage with the donor audience, right? So for a very long time, and I come from higher education, and there it was really, you went to the place where, and this is actually a quote that was in a Vox article about the generosity crisis, which is also a book from Nathan Chappell, which is interesting. But basically, she says something to the effect of, we go where the money is now, not where the money is going to be. And to a certain degree, and this goes to the unrestricted restricted thing in a very roundabout way. But we really have been talking to a lot of people who already have resources, but at the same time, we have not done a lot of work that is focused on what Tim mentioned, like the personal interests of the donors who are going to be our next major donors. So, even though there's multiple factors involved with this decline in the number of donors and the increase of the value of the major gifts, I don't think that the sector should really assume that it's all in societal factors and not also our own kind of practices. I think, Jen, you were hinting at that a little bit. One of the things that I'm observing, there's two different things going on at the same time. One, you have this trust-based philanthropy movement where, ultra high net worth donors are giving large unrestricted gifts and assuming that the experts are actually doing the work, the people who are doing the work on the ground. At the same time, you're also still seeing a lot of gifts that have a lot of restrictions to it. And sometimes you really just get there because you have these conversations with donors about what is important to them, right? So, the restriction conversation comes to like, well, this is what we're going to do with your funding, right? And this is not just the donor telling, you have to do X, Y, or Z. It's also us suggesting to the donor that, we are going to do X, Y, or Z. I also think that if you look at the history of United Way, right, we have typically gone out in the community and says like, trust us, we can do a lot of good work with your funding, right? So it's not been a thing that has been on the minds of a lot of United Way donors. But we see this landscape shifting, right? So we also see that decline in trust and that the changes in the workplace, changes in generations are really changing that landscape. And I think the way we think about restriction and restriction really is the only word I have to use is maybe not as binary as unrestricted and restricted, right? So you have completely restricted gifts. You can only give this scholarship to someone who comes from this little town. But it can also be like it's restricted to this particular issue area, right? So if we look at United Way particularly, like we have these 4 big pillars, right? Basic needs, safe and affordable housing, economic mobility, and early care and learning. Restriction can also mean like I only want to give a gift to early care and learning, right? And to follow up on what Tim was saying, like knowing what the donor really wants society to look like, giving in that area may be relevant. So giving people options and being flexible and being creative is really, really important, I think, in this. And then I think another thing that, I'm not completely sure is happening in the human services sector as well, but in higher education, it was certainly happening at a certain point in time, probably 15 years ago. Higher education institutions were competing on reputation. And as part of that, to really influence the rankings, they were giving a lot of tuition discounts and scholarships in order to boost the numbers, right? And what they found out is that they were giving a lot of scholarships out of general funds because of that, because they didn't have the kinds of endowed scholarships to back that up. And one of the deans that I worked with at one point basically said, like, well, wait a minute. We're giving from the general fund now, which is unrestricted funding. But if we propose to do this with a donor, we can actually free up unrestricted funding, right? And I do think it is really worthwhile for nonprofits to look at like, what are the things that we're doing from the general fund that may be of interest to a specific donor, right? So where you are substituting unrestricted funds with restricted funds. And I do really think that if you look at the changes where these personal connections with ultra high net worth donors are looking at, you have to really look at what are their goals? Like, are they people who trust your organization to do with the unrestricted funds what is best? Or are they a person who really would like to have a little bit more control? And I think there's good examples of big gifts that happened in the last week, even where even a combination of unrestricted and restricted funding was part of it, right? So it's not so much like it's either or, but it's more of a, where is the comfort level of the donor with the unrestricted or the restriction? And, it's goes to the idea that fundraising is a creative profession, is you have to really figure that out and propose the right thing to the right person at the right time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maarten. There was a theme that I was hearing in what you were sharing and Jen shared and Tim shared in those first questions. And then it really came down to my biggest takeaway is creating that space of alignment that is mission driven, right? So it does not happen over time, or it does not happen overnight. It does happen over time. and it is relationship driven versus transactional driven. And there are ways in which the human services sector, we can position the work that aligns with one's values or aligns with one's giving interest for sure. And there's tremendous opportunity to find that alignment. So thank you for sharing. We're going to come back to you, Jen, here on the next question. So from your perspective of observing the whole philanthropic sector, is this trend that we're seeing and talking about, is this worrisome? And if it is, what are the risks that nonprofits run or that the sector runs if we do not diversify the sources of gift income?
I think the sector is worried, and all of you on this call, I'm sure that you have read articles, had conversations, seen remarks about concern in the sector that's rising. And I mean, I'll say some obvious things that small donors provide to our organizations. I mean, they are providing funds. I think sometimes we lose track of that in the scale of money. And this depends on organizations and how big you are, what a small donor and a large donor is to you at your small organization versus a large or medium-sized organization. That really varies. So putting it into your context, but they do provide funds. An example that I'm familiar with through my own voluntary service at the Red Cross is in the space of disaster relief. And so just an example there, back in Hurricane Harvey days, there were 1 million people giving gifts of $100 and less, gave $25 million altogether. So that is not insignificant. That money adds up. And that's a message that when you give in a small amount, you're giving with your community, and it adds up in meaningful ways. Small donors become big ones. And if we don't start people somewhere, how do we grow them? How do we build our relationships with them? I think all of us, like, think about organization that you care about. Was your first gift the largest one that you've made? And you can say in the chat, was your first gift your largest gift? Yes or no? No, most of us start with smaller gifts, get to know the organization, begin to give more. And, so of course I want to say that from my own annual giving days, that annual giving and raising those first small gifts, it is hard. It is hard. So everybody out there who's working on that, I feel for you. I remember being a young fundraiser and being so depressed. I worked so hard on these letters and communications, and then my response rate was like 5%, 2%. So I was, that's like bootstrapping it. So it's hard. It's hard to get those donors. It's hard to retain those donors, but it is so important. And so, more philosophically, why are these small donors important? Why are people concerned? In part, I'll go back to Hank Rosso, the founder of the Fundraising School, and ideas that are in his 1991 book about achieving excellence in fundraising. Why do these gifts also matter? And so he and others subsequently have reminded us that these are a base of donors. They keep us in touch with our communities that we're serving. They help us know, are we getting it right? They help us spread the word to others. They help us, tell other people that, hey, this is a good organization. We need a lot of people doing that. Talk about trust. What's powerful in building trust? Word to mouth, word to word, person to person communication. So we need them to do that. They help get our case for support out there. They help us know if our case for support is right, or if we're off base, or if we've lost touch. And so, not to be dramatic as well, but many people are also saying they feel concerned for philanthropy's democratic purpose. So philanthropy is meant to be an avenue for many people to collectively come together to make change. And if we are not welcoming people in various ways, not just as donors, but welcoming them in various ways into our organizations, then how are we, fulfilling that purpose of philanthropy?
I appreciate what you raised, Jen, particularly around the point of donors are certainly helping the bottom line. Bringing dollars in the door is absolutely critical, but the community engagement and leveraging donors as advocates of the organization and the mission is equally powerful and critical and important as well. So thank you for sharing that. Let's see, Tim, I'm going to move to you next for our next question. What are some innovative approaches that you have seen to engage donors who make smaller gifts or to reinvigorate their support for a nonprofit's mission?
Sure, and based on this conversation, there's just so many things I want to say. First and foremost, I think you have to donors at all level need to feel like you are personally communicating with them, whether you are doing that on a one-on-one basis or on a more broad-based way. I think ultimately we want them to feel that personal touch from us, and ultimately we want to try to get to that face-to-face conversation, that casual meeting with them, but we can't always do that. And so you have to be diverse in how we communicate, whether that's through one of the things specifically that we're doing. We're utilizing a video platform at Firefly where we'll just send a quick little video thanking the donor, and when we can, we may involve someone from one of our programs to share in that communication as well. But it's so important. And I get a report every morning of all of the donations that were processed the day before. And a lot of times, I'll send a quick video, or I'll pick up the phone and call the donor. Maybe it's a $100 donor, or I see that it's a donor. There was one yesterday who's given $500, consistently over the last couple of years, but someone I've not gotten to engage with yet. So I sent them an individual email. So I think we have to do those kinds of things. Another way, I think, a creative way that I've seen is, and back to what Jen was saying, these donors not only are providing us with some of those lower level gifts, which of course can add up, but then those people become your advocates, and, in conversations that they're having within their networks. So we certainly want that. But getting those donors who are giving those small amounts, asking them to consider giving on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis, so whatever your strategy is around recurring donors, that's something that you can employ. And at Firefly, we've created what we're calling the Sparkle Society, where, and if you didn't know, a group of fireflies is actually called a sparkle. And so our Sparkle Society really is to try to engage those people and give them that same one-on-one experience. And we're having an event coming up in August where it's just a little small gathering, kind of a pop-up. Hey, we're going to be here, and it's just for our Sparkle Society members. So I think, anytime you can give them that personal experience like that, it's worthwhile. Another thing in the topic of AI is such a big one out there, and I think a few of it, Maarten and I were both at a session recently, but where AI was the topic. But you really you have to start somewhere, and you don't want it to be what you completely rely on to communicate with donors, but just helping you to do it more efficiently, or just ways that help you identify who are probably the best people that you can be communicating with right now is another tactic that you can employ.
Thank you, Tim. I mean, again, this comes down to certainly using tools such as AI, but also being creative in your diversification of the way in which you approach donors, right? I really appreciated your Sparkle Society. I could visualize the Firefly logo. I actually had the opportunity to come to the announcement when the Firefly name was announced, and it was a really moving physical experience to be a part of. And so it's really great to hear how you and Tina and the team are really leveraging that unique opportunity to uplift the brand and engage your donors along the way. Okay, so Maarten, I'm going to come to you next. So in your experience at United Way, how can organizations balance short-term fundraising goals with long-term mission sustainability in a landscape that increasingly favors those large short-term gifts?
Yeah, I think that is a really complex question. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I do think it comes down to continuing having meaningful relationships with people. And, even if somebody makes a short-term gift, they keep repeating that short-term gift, like you have a long-term relationship, right? So one of the things that I was thinking of when Tim and Jim were speaking earlier about these individual relationships, I think going back to this point where we're, as a sector, have incentivized major gift officers to go to like the people who can actually make major gifts now, is starting these relationships earlier and accepting that it's an investment in the future, right? So I think part of what we're seeing is that, yes, we're very good at closing gifts with people who have the ability to make a qualified charitable distribution from their IRA. But are we really building a relationship so that the people who are going to be able to make that same gift 10 years from now, right? So yes, like short-term success is actually being good at what brings in gift revenue now. But I think for organizations, you should also invest in what that revenue will look like in the future. And while it is really, really expensive, and you probably can make it a little less so by using productivity tools that Tim was just talking about, like AI. Like I think there's the last thing about like how we can get fundraisers in connection with individuals one-on-one more frequently by using AI productivity tools. I think that's a topic for a next sector call. I think that is really fascinating. But I do really think that part, like building trust with people, doesn't happen based on the number of emails you send them. It doesn't happen based on the number of text messages you send them. It happens when you're actually one-on-one in a room with them. And, I don't want to go too far afield with this, but I don't know, has anybody read like the Run Club is the new dating app? Tim, I'm going to follow your dating analogy here. I think there's a fatigue when it comes to people getting digital communications or using digital platforms, because there are ways in which those things don't deliver what we expect them to deliver, and that's human connection. And for long-term success, especially in the major gift realm, I think those personal relationships and building those personal relationships are very, very important. Now, what I've also heard, and Shannon, like reel me back in when I go too far, right? But is that the turnover in major gift fundraising is a threat to that as well, right? So I think for organizations, one thing that we need to do is really carefully look at how are we engaging donors who are burgeoning major gift donors or potential major gift donors really far into the future, and how do we make sure that we retain our gift officers, or at least build the kind of structures that allow those relationships to be long and not kind of fall apart with the turnover that we have. And Jen, I know you've written a lot about fundraiser retention and gift officer turnover, but I do think focusing as an organization on like what are the things that we can do to build the most meaningful long-term connections with the donors. The short-term gifts or the short period of time. So if somebody makes a major gift that has a 2-year arc on it, that's okay if you're preparing for the relationship to be long, right? And it's one of these things where other things than just the gift income or what the gift is for may be of influence over success in the future. And this is the kind of thinking that I haven't really seen with a lot of even very sophisticated organizations, because they're focusing very much on what is our income at the end of the year. But I think Firefly's mission is not going to be done at the end of the fiscal year 2025, right? That's going to hopefully at some point we'll no longer need all of this investment in the human services sector. But I don't think that our problems are going to be done anytime soon. So we need to build up long-term relationships with those people who align with the mission. That's what it comes down to in my mind.
Thanks so much, Maarten. I wrote down 3 words: beyond the gift, as you were talking. It really is. It is beyond the gift. right? Okay, let's see here. Tim, I'm going to come back to you here for this question. And for the group, we've got just a few more questions for our panelists, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. So please be thinking of questions that you have along the way. Tim, based on your consulting experience, how can nonprofits leverage data and analytics to better understand donor behavior and trends in the current giving landscape? And then you started to talk a little bit about AI here, so maybe this is where you pull it back in, but how do you foresee technology influencing the future of fundraising, and what steps should organizations be taking to be responsive and interactive with these advancements?
Certainly. And before I go into that topic, one thing that we haven't touched on a lot, maybe we can later, but we can't forget about stewardship, and going back to those donors after they've made their gifts and reporting on your success, your challenges. I mean, there's nothing worse than going back to a donor at the end of the year saying, "Oh, well, we couldn't achieve this, so hey, this is the first time you're hearing about it," but just reporting, because donors don't want to be surprised. And I generally, I think, 95% of the time they're going to understand because they're in business themselves. I mean, there are challenges out there and they just want to know, how are you addressing that? So going back to the topic of using some of the AI and some of those technologies, many of us have heard and maybe experienced the wealth screenings out there that indicate which donors have the capacity. But I also think we have to make sure and understand which donors rise to the top in terms of interest and involvement in your organization. And if you can marry those two, capacity, which we have no control over, but influence and interest and connection, I mean, that's certainly something that we have to do. I think that's a way in which we can utilize data that's out there. I mean, something fairly basic, but it's a great reminder. I mean, utilize the information, the data that comes from Giving USA and the Giving USA report every year. I mean, even if it's as simple as where the gift's coming from, and just understanding the pie and being able to track your pie, your organization against national averages. In my consulting years, I never saw an organization that lined up exactly. I mean, I don't think it necessarily happens, but at least gives you the information to be able to strive toward, where do we need to put more emphasis? Where do we need to put more resources out there? But I think that's another another one of those things that we can do. But again, take a look at both paid resources, but also free resources that are out there to be able to understand your donors better and know where can you be the most efficient in focusing your time. And that just doesn't have to be on the ultra high net worth side, but that could be on the direct mail side and the some of those other more broad-based topics that are out there. And one other thing I'd like to add, there are leaders from organizations on the call. It's when you think about those lower level donors and creating special initiatives around that. I mean, those things don't just happen. Someone has to be responsible for that. And I would really encourage you all to Google the article that Maarten referenced, that was on Vox. It was about the generosity crisis. And so just Google generosity crisis Vox. I bet you'll come up with this article. But it really, you have to not only go to what I think of someone who would always talk about skate to where the puck is, but think about where the donors are today. But what are you doing today to engage those donors who will be your donors tomorrow, in a way that, and understanding that we don't necessarily know exactly how they're going to give tomorrow. Let's meet them where they are today. Maybe they're giving you donated material items. Like one thing we utilize at at Firefly for the people we serve, it's donated items. Maybe it's hair care products, maybe it's personal care, it's diapers, it's, think of a myriad of things. Right now we're, thinking about back to school initiatives. So if that's a way a donor feels like they're being generous, let's meet them where they are, and let's utilize that until we know where they're going to be later in life when they're making those investment types of gifts.
Absolutely, certainly. And Tim, you mentioned some resources, both free and paid. And so our team will commit to gathering them all together and sharing them in the follow-up after this call as well. And we would certainly be so deeply appreciative of your eyes and Maarten's eyes and Jen's eyes on those lists as well to help contribute. So thank you.
Certainly.
All right, Maarten, I'm gonna give one more question to you, and then we've got one question for the rest of the group, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. So Maarten, what role do partnerships and collaborations play in adapting to the new trends in philanthropy? Can you provide examples of successful partnerships that you have encountered?
When I was thinking about this question, when we looked through the questions beforehand, like the one that came up that is just a personal experience about a partnership that worked out really well was the shared application for Indianapolis arts organizations to a majority of the big foundations that were funding the arts at that time. And it really struck me is that for the applicants, it was really a incredible decrease in how much they had to do for each individual. And because typically those applications were just repeating the same questions, and they all needed the same information, and they all kind of needed to know, like, who else is funding you, right? So and when I'm thinking about like how this translates to the current moment, right? It's thinking about like, what is it that we're doing as a sector that can be done more broadly and maybe has more impact, right? And because the problems that we're solving individually as organizations may be limited to an area, or it may be limited to a specific part of what people who are in poverty, for example, experience. And one of the things I think is very, very important in the current moment is that impact, rather than trust or belonging, drives a lot of donors' decision making. And if you think about the opportunity that partnerships or collaboration brings, because and at United Way, this is a particular area that we are interested in, of course, because we support so many different organizations who are doing a lot of bits and pieces in this human services sector. But like, you can think about like, what is the impact that a donor actually would like to have, going back to Tim's point about like the personal interest and alignment with the mission, and how can we achieve that impact by being creative. One of the big challenges with partnerships and collaborations, and I saw this in a very large university setting, is that who owns what part of the partnership, or who owns the partnership in general, is often a little bit of a sticking point. And I would just invite everybody to think about like, how can you get away from those things and really look at the eventual impact? Because I think the power of collaboration is really in achieving lots of missions at the same time, or solving one particular problem with the help of a donor. And I think especially the ultra high net worth donors, because the capacity is just so much larger in many of these cases, thinking bigger often helps, but it often extends beyond your own mission, right? So if you are a community center that focuses on one particular neighborhood, you may not have the opportunities that would excite a person who has, like Michael Bloomberg, $1 billion to invest, right? Because $1 billion for one particular neighborhood is too much money, right? But how can you band together to fix one particular issue that all these different neighborhood centers together have as a community? That may attract a donor or a foundation that has that kind of capacity to make impact. And I think the real importance there is to set aside your own your own interests, but really look at like, what are we trying to do as a community? And I think the value of collaborations like shows in the effect in that.
Yeah, Maarten, as you were speaking, for someone who has spent my entire career on the impact side of things, what you were describing is a collective impact model. And I was jotting down as you were talking, collective impact fueled by collective investment. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what this is about, right? So thanks for sharing. I don't know if I just coined something or not. I don't think I did, but
let's say you did. Let's say you did. You heard it
right,
here first.
What's that?
You heard it here first.
Heard it here first. That's right. We've got one final question for the panel, and I'll ask Jen if you wouldn't mind sharing first, and then Tim, and then Maarten, if you could close us out before we take questions from everyone. What emerging trends in philanthropy should nonprofits be aware of, and how can they prepare for these future changes? So perhaps it's something that you've already shared that you would like to underscore and lift up again. But any final words that you would share around emerging trends and the experts that are on this call with you all today and your colleagues in community impact and human services, what should we be aware of?
Well, thanks so much, Shannon, for that question, and perfect question to wrap up our talking and get to hear the questions of the group. So just a couple of things that came to mind for me. One does tie back to something I said around Gen Z. And we're seeing more giving, more charitable interest from that generation. We're figuring out how to engage with them. Also, as we look ahead into the future, there is a great deal of wealth that is coming down the pipeline to Gen Z. So that will, you can look up, the New York Times has some good graphics that show us where the wealth is going to go through generational transfers. And it's really ahead of us at Gen Z. And so I think that some of those comments that Maarten and Tim made about let's think about the future are really important. And as we continue to think about now, I know many of you, you're raising your budgets for this year right now. So we've got to do that, certainly. But how do we think about the future? Speaking of young people, I've been fascinated, all of us are young people inside, right? But speaking of, so thinking of social media, young people, it's been amazing to see how influential platforms like TikTok are in the business world. And so I think there's a lot more opportunities still for the nonprofit sector to get more into that, think about how creators and influencers can help us, even local people in those spaces, take some inspiration from business and how those people are driving people to restaurants, to films, to all kinds of things. And so how do we follow that lead? Also, and this is something that I have a project working on, and that is around the potential of DAFs, and so donor advised funds. And there's more and more research and knowledge now about DAFs, and we're involved in a project now that has been about interviewing fundraisers to learn how they're successful at raising money for DAFs and what else they'd like to know and need to know to be more successful. So there is a lot of money and interest in DAFs and an opportunity for us to keep honing our skills in how to work with those donors who I believe have already expressed a philanthropic intent by creating that DAF. So they are one step on the path with us already. And so I think there's exciting potential there. And also I'll say that in the realm of knowledge, we know more and more about how diverse communities give and what they care about, their preferences. And I mean, I'm talking about diversity in a variety of realms. And so I think that we can use that to continue to help our organizations be more welcoming. And so I think there's a lot of potential there for fundraising, also, to be better deliverers of our mission through understanding all the many communities that make up our city and our country. So I think that's really exciting too.
Outstanding. I think that may be hard to follow from Jen. So, and I apologize to all of you. I'm having computer issues. My computer wanted to die in the middle of moderating a panel, so that's fun.
Uh-oh.
So
Yeah,
I ran to find a new charger, so I apologize. So Tim, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Do you have any final words that you would share with all of us?
One, I'll agree with you. It's hard to follow Jen on that. There's so much good information packed in that response. One thing I'm going to go back to really a couple things. I think you've got to balance the now and the future, and that's not necessarily a trend, but really understand, in my experience being in organizations and consulting with organizations, is that our donor populations are aging. So we have to understand that, and we have to know how we're going to fill those places. That won't happen overnight, and you've got to continue to again, I've always said in my life, things don't happen, you've got to make them happen. So to make those new donors happen, or get to the place where you want them to be. Thinking of Gen X, again, I'm going to kind of piggyback on something, or the generation, something that Jen said. Don't forget that the smallest generation is Gen X, which is the generation I'm in. And in that group of individuals, sorry, Tina, it's not me, but that individuals, they're going to be the wealthiest, coming, as boomers pass. Then, don't forget about that small and unique generation, Gen X. But continue to meet your donors where they are, and I think that encompasses to what Jen said, and just related to all the diversity of donors we have, and donors are not monolithic. We have to understand who they are, so an approach may not work for every single group, but really you have to tailor your request, your need, your engagement to the donor who's right there in front of you, or who you're targeting.
Absolutely. One of my very simple but meaningful takeaways from what you all have shared is that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So Maarten, I'm going to turn it to you to close us out before we open for questions from the group.
Well, if you follow Jen and Tim, you come off as the village idiot, which is probably accurate for me. But one of the things that I wanted to add to all of that is look inside your organization for people who have lived experience that aligns with some of the issues that you're trying to solve if it comes to fundraising, right? Listen to your fundraising team. Like, I have a very age diverse team. Like, there's from 70 all the way down to 23. So I have a lot of generations represented. And if I have questions about something, there's always somebody who has some lived experience there, right? So listen to the team that you have, and understand it from a perspective that they hear things out in the community as well. If you have a frontline fundraising team, they meet with donors, and it's the same with in United Way especially. We have an impact team, a program team, and that program team runs through a lot of examples of the bigger trends that we're reading about in, like, Giving USA, right? So there's a source of information that we often leave untapped. And I just want to encourage everybody on the call to look internally and see, like, who has lived experience or expertise in a particular area, or in a lived experience.
Great. Well, thank you, Jen and Tim and Maarten, for sharing your wisdom and your experience with the group here. We'd like to hang on to you just for a few more minutes to see if there are questions from the group. So participants, I would encourage you to come off mute, ask your question, or drop it into the chat. But it looks like we already have one noted here in the chat. So are there any tips on how to encourage folks to let go of their donor advised fund dollars? I've seen data that funds are being held. Any tips from the panelists on this question?
I can say a few things on this. I'll share in the chat just a minute a link to the DAF Research Collaborative. And they have many reports examining the state of DAFs, DAF donors. That's from where our fundraising project will come from. And I want to say that from this most recent study, the 2024 National Study on Donor Advised Funds, among those findings are the fact that about half of all DAFs, 54%, granted out at least half their original contribution within 3 years. And so that's telling us that, you know, DAF donors are giving out money. Usually it takes people a little time to kind of get up and rolling. The report has a breakdown of, you know, how long it's taking for people to go on this. And so more money is going out of DAFs than is coming in generally. So there's a lot going in, there's a lot going out. But remember, DAFs are also growing through the stock market, but when they are with the provider. There are also from DAF Collaborative Research, my colleagues Dan Heist and Danielle Vance McMullen have developed a structure, a schematic for understanding donors. The DAF donors called tubs, tanks, and towers. And so in that model, they have found 3 different kinds of DAF donors. So the tub donor, which fills up their bathtub with money. So using this kind of water analogy, fills it up and then releases it like in a big rush, like you might when in the bath. So there's donors giving that style. There's tank donors who are kind of filling it up and then releasing it out. And then there's towers who are, you know, holding it longer and then releasing it slower. So they've defined these different kinds of DAF donors. And so I think if we can understand the style through our cultivation and conversations with DAF donors, that we can kind of begin to see how they're using their DAF and seek funds in appropriate ways from them. I'll also say that a lot of DAFs are smaller. The average DAF size is actually $50,000. So we think about DAFs as being enormous, but actually more, you know, they are quite accessible now. And any of us could found one that you can open a DAF for with very small initial investment. And so that is to say that DAF gifts can be smaller as well. And so thinking too about how are we communicating with all types of donors that may have a DAF, even as a smaller donor, and encouraging them to use their DAFs for that purpose as well. So I think my advice is, you know, getting to know the particular style of the donors who you have who make larger gifts with DAFs, but then also remembering that people giving in smaller amounts may have DAFs, and at times being an advocate for your donor and realizing that for some of them, a DAF is a good solution to how they give. And thinking, as Maarten and Tim were saying, you know, who is this donor that we know gives to lots of organizations? You know, how do we support them and their giving and the community they support by like helping them use their DAF as a tool that benefits many of our organizations.
I think if I'm going to jump in, if you take anything from a tactical basis, I mean, what Jen just said, tubs, tanks, and towers. I mean, that's the most useful thing. Jen, this was the first time I'd heard that. And because I think about a DAF as just a different checkbook that a donor may give to you from. So it's not about the complication necessarily of the giving vehicle. And so you're not going to be able to convince any donor to get rid of money that's in their checkbook unless they want to. So first and foremost, you connect with the donors, and then you get to a point in that conversation where you realize how they may want to fund that gift. And so understanding how those donors are giving, that's some very practical knowledge. And don't forget, you're cultivating the individual, not the DAF.
That's a good point. Tim, we've got about time for about one more response to a question that is actually for you. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues here at United Way to close us out. And again, I think there's certainly opportunity for a whole entire additional conversation around this, and we'll make note of that. But regarding AI, can you give the group just an idea or an example of a platform or a tool that you find useful for this work?
So I'll give two examples. One I have personal experience with, one that I just heard about. And so, one, and not selling products from my former employer, but JGA has a product that they called Acuity, and Acuity marries together engagement. The organization gives the markers of engagement. What are we tracking from an engagement standpoint? And then they pull in the wealth information, and they marry all of that so that then you can prioritize who are the most important people that you should be working with. So that's one. Another product I've heard about, but I heard someone really talk about it earlier. There's a platform out there where, and I believe it's Gravity. That's the name of the company. And Gail from Gleaners talked about it at the session that Maarten and I were at recently. But they have a system that ties into your database, and if you have gift officers or anyone that has a certain group of donors assigned to them, it'll pop up an email in your inbox that, hey, you haven't talked to this donor in some time. Here's a suggested email. You don't have to send it. You don't have to use the exact verbiage that platform is suggesting, but it's a place to start, and it just helps you realize, who haven't I talked to in a while?
Terrific. Thank you for sharing those, Tim, and we will be sure to add those to the list of resources that we share. So again, thank you to each of you for taking time this morning to share your wisdom and your experience with this group. I have a full page of notes, and I would imagine those on the call have the same. So again, thank you for sharing. It was a pleasure to talk with each of you this morning about this really important topic. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deja, who will close us out.
Thank you so much, Shannon. And again, I want to mirror your enthusiasm and your gratitude to Maarten, Jen, Tim. This was a great conversation. I take notes on the back end, and similar to Shannon, I literally have a full page of quotes and notes just based on this discussion. So some really great insights. I hope that everyone benefited from this conversation as well. We would love to have you all back for our next sector call on August 16th, which will cover harvesting equality, cultivating food security and nutrition justice, bright and early at 8:30 a.m. via Zoom here again. But again, we want to thank you for your continued collaboration in this space. This is very important to convene on a monthly basis and discuss the topics that we are all similarly facing and seeing in our sector. So we really appreciate you all logging on and hope to see you back for the next call. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Happy Friday, everyone.
Happy Friday.